Have you ever heard of Roadside Picnic, the science fiction novel written by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky? Of all the hundreds of science fiction books written in the Soviet Union, Roadside Picnic numbers among the few that both have been translated into English and are accessible here in the United States. Arguably, it has the greatest legacy of any of the Soviet science fiction books, at least in America. The only real contender that comes to mind is Stanislaw Lem's Solaris. Both of these novels have film adaptations by the renowned Soviet filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. Solaris even has a remake from 2002, directed by Steven Soderbergh and starring George Clooney. Roadside Picnic has the upper hand, perhaps, insofar that it has had a greater tangible impact on contemporary art and culture here in 2026. The entire genre of extraction shooter video games can trace its lineage back to this book. Liminal and existential science fiction horror has a debt as well, including, but certainly not limited to, the film Annihilation and the Metro video game series. And of course, there is the Stalker series of games that is directly inspired, and in some sense an adaptation, of Roadside Picnic. The second major installment in this series, Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl, released in November 2024. There is some groundwork that needs to be laid before I can talk in more depth about the Stalker games or the Stalker film. So let's go back to the beginning. What is Roadside Picnic, and why is it significant? Arkady Strugatsky, a Japanese and English interpreter, and his brother Boris, a computer engineer, partnered in the late 1950s to write science fiction novels. They were an important part of a renaissance in Soviet science fiction literature. Depending on who you ask, their first published story was either From Beyond or Land of the Crimson Clouds. Some sources claim Land of the Crimson Clouds was published in 1957, and others say that it wasn't published until 1959, while From Beyond was published in 1958. Regardless, Land of the Crimson Clouds is considered their first major work, as it received a third-place award in 1959 for Best Book on Science and Technology for School-Aged Children. Within a decade, the Strugatskys would become prominent figures in the world of Soviet science fiction, having widespread domestic popularity and some measure of international acclaim. As science fiction writers active in the 50s and 60s, they were contemporaries of Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, and Frank Herbert.
Твой путь завершается. Иди ко мне.
Roadside Picnic recounts one man's experience of the aftermath of supernatural events that transformed a region outside his hometown into a place of danger and mystery known as the Zone. Scientists speculate that the Zone was created by accident when some alien race dumped or forgot their garbage on Earth. What these aliens count as garbage, humanity's brightest cannot begin to understand. If anyone is able to figure out how this refuse works, humanity's technology will leap forward 1,000 years. Roadside Picnic narrates several episodes from the life of Red Shoehart, an adventurer, treasure hunter, and mercenary. He is a stalker, someone who journeys into the Zone in search of valuable artifacts. The most mysterious and powerful of these artifacts is known as the Golden Sphere. The few stalkers who have managed to find it report that it can grant wishes. Thematically, this story represents a maturation of the themes the Strugatskys had explored in their earlier works. Their optimism for a brighter, utopic future has been mellowed by despair over the flaws of individuals and the fundamentally backwards nature of institutions and bureaucracy. Early in their career, the Strugatskys produced adventure stories in the style of the early science fiction literature from the 20s and 30s. As they developed as writers and grew in popularity, their work took on a more mature, even political character. They gained enough acclaim to have some of their books translated, granting them an amount of exposure in the West. At some point, a rumor spread that they were political dissidents, struggling against the oppression of the Soviet Union. This rumor served to increase their popularity among Western readers, despite the Strugatskys' repeated denial of any such claims. However unsubstantiated, this rumor may have been to their benefit. To this day, the Strugatskys number among the few Soviet science fiction authors whose works have both been translated into English and are relatively easy to find. They are accompanied by Ivan Antonovich Efremov and Stanislaw Lem, but few others. Not very many Americans will engage with Soviet-era Russian artists unless their dissidence is a matter of historical record, as is the case for Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Vladimir Voinovich, and Andrei Tarkovsky. That is just speculation on my part. However, it does appear to be the case that the matter of the Strugatskys' political dissidence was greatly exaggerated. The Strugatskys never publicly voiced any dissenting political views. On the contrary, they repeatedly refuted any claims regarding their dissension. Of course, it is possible this was all for show, and the Strugatskys really were anti-Soviet activists who were disguising their pamphlets as science fiction in order to bypass the censors, but unlikely. That is to say, most likely, the Strugatskys were not political dissidents, but that does not mean they were not critical. Many of their early works were satirical in nature, where the satire was obviously directed towards Soviet bureaucracy. Yet they were committed Marxists. While neither brother ever joined the Communist Party, they embraced Marxist ideology. While they did direct jabs toward the Soviet instantiation of Marxism, their early works exhibited an optimism for the inevitable end of capitalism and the establishment of a global communist utopia. In these stories, conflict did not arise from class struggle, but rather from human responses toward advances in science and technology. By the early 1970s, the Strugatsky brothers had become prolific and well-known science fiction writers within and without the Soviet Union. In 1971, Arkady and Boris Strugatsky wrote Roadside Picnic. In 1972, the Leningrad-based periodical Aurora printed Roadside Picnic, after the usual round of revisions requested by Soviet censors. In an afterword of Olena Bormashenko's English translation of Roadside Picnic, Boris provides a list of requested changes that he and his brother had to make prior to the initial publication in Aurora. Vulgar language such as the word asshole, descriptions of physical violence, and generally immoral behavior were marked. The censors seemed to take issue in particular with the protagonist's alcoholism. Phrases such as take out the flask, unscrew it, and attach myself to it like a leech, and I'll get plastered tonight, I gotta beat Richard, were prohibited in a book with a target audience that presumably consisted of teenagers. The Strugatskys had extreme difficulty keeping Roadside Picnic in print. For close to a decade, they could not get permission to print it as its own book, or even as part of an anthology. This situation does not make them unique or even notable. I have no doubt there have been and will be countless aspiring authors who never managed to see a single book published. Yet, by the 1970s, the Strugatskys had published over a dozen novels and numerous short stories. They had even managed to get Roadside Picnic in print, even if it was only in a periodical. The Strugatskys were among the most popular science fiction authors in the Soviet Union, so it does seem surprising that publishers were not leaping at the opportunity to print one of their books, which would almost certainly sell a large number of copies. However, publishers did not work the same way in the Soviet Union as they do in most of the world today. The Soviet Union, being a communist state, subsidized the arts. As a musician, you could receive a salary and perform at public concert venues. Likewise, authors and filmmakers received compensation for their work. Arkady and Boris Strugatsky would have received a fee for every book of theirs that was published. Of course, the state had a say in what music was played in the public concert venues, what films were funded and shown in public cinemas, and what books were printed in the public publishing houses, for better or for worse. In return for this control, These concert venues, cinemas, and publishers were treated as public services rather than businesses. Not everyone was willing to make this trade. There were many independent, underground artists in the Soviet Union, including a flourishing rock scene in the 70s and 80s. Musicians like Victor Tsoi and Yuri Kasparyan wrote and played music while working day jobs. As independent artists, they did not receive state funding and were not allowed to play at public venues, yet they became some of the most popular artists in the Soviet Union. However, there was no such thing as an independent publisher. Authors did not have other options. In order to be published, they had to submit their work through official channels. Since the publishing houses were state-run and not businesses, they were not concerned with making a profit. In a planned economy, the concept of profit has no place, since prices are set by the state. The financial viability of a book has little to do with its quality as literature, and is certainly not the only factor under consideration for a publishing house in a planned economy. It may not be a factor at all. Even though the Strugatsky brothers had proven their ability to write books that sold well, their profit potential would not have made them more attractive to publishers, at least in the Soviet Union. There are numerous possibilities why a publishing house would hesitate to publish Roadside Picnic. It might have been as simple as the publishing house did not have sufficient resources to print another book. At times, the Soviet Union experienced shortages of book-quality paper. It also seems to be the case that priority for reprints was given to more classical authors and not low genres like science fiction. Or it is also possible that the publishing houses simply didn't think Roadside Picnic was good enough to warrant a reprint. The general consensus in the scholarship on the Strugatsky brothers is that from 1969 to 1974, their literary output was weaker and of lesser quality than usual, with the notable exception, perhaps in hindsight, of Roadside Picnic. I have been avoiding the obvious possibility, which is that the Strugatskys may have been subject to censorship. Censorship can mean a variety of things, so let me clarify. I can think of at least two distinct kinds of censorship. The first is total censorship, where the totality of a piece of writing or work of art or some other product of human labor is banned. The second is partial censorship, where only a part of the material is banned, such as foul language or other offensive content. I hope I have put to rest the notion of the Strugatskys as political dissidents, but at the same time, the Strugatskys did make liberal use of satire, which could be interpreted in no other way than criticism of Soviet bureaucracy. This begs the question whether the Strugatskys ran afoul of the censors with respect to Roadside Picnic. Considering that Roadside Picnic had already been printed, I feel I can say with some confidence that Roadside Picnic never experienced total censorship by the state. I find it much more likely that the Strugatskys ran afoul of other influential individuals, particularly public officials who oversaw the publishing houses. One such individual went by the name of Yuri Medvedev. He had just been appointed in 1973 as the head of the fiction department of the Molodaya Gvardia, or the Young Guard publishing house, when the Strugatskys submitted a manuscript for an anthology of their stories that included Roadside Picnic. His personal interest in moral purity, beauty, and supreme reason led him to disapprove of Roadside Picnic, where aliens treat the Earth like a garbage dump and many of the characters are motivated by greed. He probably had a hand in blocking the publication of Roadside Picnic. The Molodaya Gvardia was run by the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, which had been established in 1918 soon after the revolution, meaning the Molodaya Gvardia held a position of cultural leadership in the Soviet Union. Consequently, Yuri Medvedev had influence that exceeded the norm as a mere department head. It is possible that thanks to his meddling, the Strugatskys saw many publishing houses refuse to put any of their books in print, including Roadside Picnic. There is yet another potential reason why the Strugatskys experienced resistance, but for the sake of rhetorical effect, I will save it for later. Regardless, Roadside Picnic eventually did get published in the Soviet Union as its own book. However, this did not happen until 1980, after Andrei Tarkovsky's adaptation of it into the film Stalker.
Твое желание скоро исполнится. Иди ко мне.
Stalker follows the journey of a physicist, an author, and their stalker guide to the center of the zone. They are seeking a structure deep within known as the Room, a place that is rumored to fulfill the deepest desire of any who enters. Within a year of its publication, Roadside Picnic had caught the attention of Andrei Tarkovsky, a director with a portfolio of 4 feature films, including an adaptation of Solaris. Andrei was a fan of the Strugatskys. According to his journal, Andrei finished reading Roadside Picnic on January 26, 1973. He wrote, "I just read the Strugatsky brothers' science fiction story Roadside Picnic. It could make a wonderful script." The admiration was mutual. The Strugatsky brothers were fans of Andrei's work, especially Solaris. At first, Andrei recommended Roadside Picnic to another director, his friend Georgy Kalatazishvili, in hope that Georgy would adapt it into a film. Georgy took the recommendation and began to work with the Strugatskys. With some contributions from Andrei, they finished a draft of the script by early 1975. However, Georgy abandoned the project. The reasons for this are unclear, so Andrei took it upon himself to adapt Roadside Picnic into a film. In April 1975, Arkady submitted an application to the film studio Mosfilm to produce a film from the script. Only Arkady and Boris's names appeared on the application, however. Despite his substantial contributions, Andrei opted to leave his own name out. His given reason: if he received any money directly from Mosfilm, he must pay alimony out of it. Instead, Arkady and Boris agreed to pay him his share under the table. All that remained was for Mosfilm to greenlight the project and filming to begin, provided everything went smoothly. Everything did not go smoothly. Nothing went smoothly. The first issue involved the script. Immediately after reading the book, Andrei had an image in his mind of what sort of film it could be adapted into. The first draft of the script the Strugatskys put together in 1975 did not fit that image. Andrei had them rewrite the entire script, which they accomplished in 1976. By this time, Andrei had settled on a name for the project: The Machine of Desires. This version of the script drew heavily from the final chapter of Roadside Picnic, which relates Red's search for the Golden Sphere. The Strugatskys published this version of the script as a companion book to the film in 1981, though changes continued to be made, and the final script diverged significantly from this published version. Second, Mosfilm was dragging its feet in the approval process. Eventually, Andrei appealed to the USSR State Committee for Cinematography, also known as Goskino, in order to speed things along. Without Mosfilm's greenlight, he could not begin filming. If he did not begin filming, he would not be performing his job as a film director. If he was not performing his job as a film director, he would not be paid. As a citizen of the Soviet Union, he had a right to work, so the committee had an obligation to resolve the issue. When Andrei received a reply from the committee, he was informed that Mosfilm had been unaware of his association with the script because his name was not on the original script submission. As it turns out, the Strugatskys had been silently blacklisted because of one of their earlier film scripts, The Fighting Cat Returns to Hell. This script had been adapted from their novel The Kid from Hell, which had been published back in 1973. The plot follows the adventures of Gak from the planet Giganda, who becomes trapped on Earth and is trying to make it back to Giganda in order to fight against the forces of the Empire. Although the book was allowed to be published, the adapted script was totally censored, banned in its entirety, because it was understood to be advocating for Zionism, along with other imperialist violent ideologies. Though initially supportive of the establishment of the State of Israel, The Soviet Union had since changed its stance as it became clear that Israel was a front for American imperialism and an excuse for Western meddling in the Middle East. Tensions came to a head in 1967 when American-backed Israel attacked Soviet-backed Egypt, starting the Six-Day War. Hostilities ceased after the titular 6 days, with Israel occupying the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Conflict arose again in 1973 between Israel and a coalition led by Egypt and Syria. Arkady and Boris Strugatsky had a Jewish father, and in 1973 they published a book that potentially was Zionist. Let's give the Strugatskys the benefit of the doubt and say that The Kid from Hell only had an accidental resemblance to imperialist ideology. They could not have picked a worse time to publish that book. Damn. After Andrei's appeal to Goskino, he received a response from the chairman, Philip Timofeyevich Yermash, who gave the green light for Stalker. Andrei and his crew started filming on February 15, 1977, but not before an earthquake devastated Isfara, Tajikistan, the original location where Andrei wanted to film. Any suitable housing where the crew could stay was destroyed, so the production relocated to an abandoned chemical factory near Tallinn, Estonia. Now the real troubles could begin. The script still was not finished, at least according to Andrei's standards. It underwent continual revision throughout the production. Various accounts claim that 9, 11, or 13 different versions of the script were produced. The general consensus is that the highest number is the most accurate. In addition to script fluidity, the crew discovered a flaw with one of the cameras after shooting more than a kilometer of film. Only 400 meters of it was usable. Despite this setback, filming concluded in August. 10 kilometers of film were sent to Mosfilm's lab in Moscow to be developed, after which would begin the long, arduous process of editing. Some of the individual shots were so long that special vats had to be constructed in order to develop the film. The chemical mix in the vat could be tuned such that a single shot would contain multiple color gradients. Cinematographer Georgy Rerberg shot the film on Kodak 5247 stock, which the Mosfilm lab had never used before, and they botched the development horribly. Most of the developed prints came out with a green tint and were completely unusable. 6 kilometers of the original 10 were ruined, and with it, 300,000 rubles of the film production's 500,000 ruble budget down the drain. Reportedly, a single shot of this film made it into the final cut. Along with Stalker, the Mosfilm lab ruined the film of 3 other productions. The film itself was affected, and since no copies had been made, the only option left was to shoot the whole thing again. On September 20th, filming began a second time. Andrei replaced Georgy with Leonid Kalashnikov. Andrei also took the opportunity to rewrite the script again, with a radical change to the protagonist. The Stalker was no longer the thief and criminal of Roadside Picnic, but a kind of holy pilgrim, an evangelist of the zone. The second filming concluded in October. Andrei was not happy with the result and fired Leonid. Not a single shot from this second Stalker made it into the final cut. On April 7th, Andrei had a heart attack. Thankfully, it was minor and he recovered in a few months. Filming began a third time in July of 1978 with a new cinematographer, Alexander Nyazinsky. Andrei had procured further funding by pitching a 2-part film to Mosfilm, doubling his initial budget of 500,000 rubles to 1 million, which he promptly spent on Stalker. This third and final filming concluded in December, and the editing process was completed by March the following year. It premiered on June 15th and had a limited theatrical release in March 1980. Officials at the Goskino complained that the film was too slow and boring. However, the film was a financial success, costing around 1 million rubles to produce and grossing upwards of 2 million rubles. There is some speculation that the chemical waste present at the abandoned factories where much of Stalker was filmed contributed to the early deaths of the actor Anatoly Solzhenitsyn, Andrei Tarkovsky, and his wife Larissa, who had been deeply involved in the film's production. All three died of lung cancer. Anatoly passed away in 1982 when he was 47 years old. Andrei passed away in 1986 at the age of 54. Larissa survived the longest, dying in 1998 when she was 65 years old.
Иди ко мне. Ты обретешь то, что заслуживаешь.
Both of these episodes illustrate a desperate tenacity that resulted in a beautiful work of art. I would not be at all surprised if you have a strong temptation to attribute many of the hardships experienced by the Strugatsky brothers and Andrei Tarkovsky to the oppression of a communist state. I hope I have presented a compelling case that the situation was just a bit more nuanced than that. These artists were victims of the bumbling Soviet bureaucracy, but those Soviet officials often had reasonable concerns. Both Roadside Picnic and Stalker certainly underwent content censorship. They were not allowed to include foul words and phrases, or characterizations that could potentially encourage antisocial behavior. But there are many things that ought to be censored, such as snuff films and child pornography. So censorship in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. On the contrary, it most certainly can be used to do good. The complaint against Soviet censorship then must revolve around the quantity of censorship, particularly political censorship. Yet, even in America, despite the supposed protection of the First Amendment, censorship is not uncommon. From book burnings and prosecution of journalists in the 50s to suppression of climate studies in the 2000s, the land of the free has put a check on the information accessible to the American people and the sorts of political views one can freely express. To be fair, any complaint against Soviet censorship also applies to American censorship. Saying that one is good and the other is bad has less to do with the actual censorship than the social framework which underpins the censorship. For the sake of my fragile political freedom, I'm going to cut off this line of thought here. Regardless of the extent to which Roadside Picnic underwent censorship, we still have access to Roadside Picnic and Stalker 50 years later. The legacy of Roadside Picnic and Stalker lives on. In 2000, the indie video game developer GSC Game World began work on a game that would become the spiritual successor to both Roadside Picnic and Stalker. The game development had its own share of struggles and setbacks, ranging from an unclear vision and too broad scope to delays and missed deadlines. Initially, the project had the name Oblivion Lost and had little to do with Roadside Picnic. Early builds of the game featured aliens and temple ruins inspired by Mayan and Aztec structures. The game gradually morphed into a loose adaptation of the film Stalker, as well as Roadside Picnic, taking gameplay mechanics from the book and visual style and atmosphere from the film. In 2002, the development team visited the Chernobyl exclusion zone for inspiration, as well as to take pictures and collect data for game assets. After this trip, they shifted the direction of the game to be more directly inspired by Roadside Picnic, renaming the project Stalker Oblivion Lost. In 2003, the team settled on the final title, Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl. They intended to name it directly after the film Stalker, but they did not have the rights, so they changed just enough to keep the lawyers happy. After many revisions, cut features, and compromises on the scope, they finally produced something that is flawed, incomplete, and sometimes barely functioning. The game was released in 2007. Yet, for all its shortcomings, Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl is still a fun, innovative experience that is a significant influence on many modern games, such as Fallout 4, Metro Exodus, and Marathon. It was enough of a financial success to have two immediate sequels, Stalker Clear Sky in 2008 and Stalker Call of Pripyat in 2009. The Stalker games have a vibrant modding community that has kept them alive by fixing bugs, increasing the difficulty, and expanding the survival mechanics that made the originals stand out in the 2000s. The most comprehensive and popular mod pack, Gamma, made some waves a couple years ago thanks to a surge in online attention. And in November 2024, GSC Game World released Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl, a modern update to the franchise that maintains some of the buggy charm of the originals while expanding the horror and survival elements in ways that simply were not possible back in 2007. Perhaps the most significant departure of the games from the source material lies in the games grounding themselves in the Chernobyl disaster. Of course, the Chernobyl reactor meltdown did not happen until 1986. From the perspective of the games, the origin of the zone lay in a man-made disaster caused by meddling with forces beyond our comprehension. In Roadside Picnic, blame for the zone lay with aliens that also lay outside our comprehension. In the film, no explanation is given for the zone, but it is implicit that it is outside our comprehension. I also have heard rumors that the setting of the film was inspired to some extent by the exclusion zone around the site of a previous nuclear disaster, the Kishtim disaster. Until Chernobyl, Kishtim had been the worst nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union. So maybe they aren't so different after all. The narrative needs of each medium is different, and the original concept has been adapted to each. I highly recommend all three if you have any interest at all in science fiction, literature, film, or video games. There is value to be gained from interacting with Roadside Picnic or either of its subsequent adaptations.
Я вижу твое желание.
I thought I'd add a few comments about my experience conducting research for this video. I've been working on this project on and off since November of 2023. It was and still is incredibly difficult to find original sources for anything related to the Soviet Union. One of the big reasons for this is that most of what is accessible is in Russian, which I do not speak, and Google Translate can only go so far. My early attempts to verify sources and track down names led me to some strange places, including declassified CIA documents containing lists of Soviet officials. Researching the topic of Soviet censorship turned into a bizarre struggle against modern forms of American censorship. American censorship is particularly insidious precisely because most Americans do not believe it exists. Once you seriously endeavor to learn about non-English speaking countries, or topics that lie outside the mainstream political narrative, it will make its existence known. The situation has grown a little better since 2023, but not by much. Most of the scholarship is hidden in obscure books written in the 90s that are out of print and rarely have PDF versions. An even smaller proportion is available in English. Any current scholarship is locked behind journal paywalls. During that time, the English Wikipedia page for Arkady and Boris Strugatsky has grown 5 times in length. I expect much of this growth was spurred by a growing interest in Roadside Picnic due to the release of Stalker 2. Thankfully, Roadside Picnic, Tarkovsky's Stalker, and the video game Stalker are easy to find. There's a good chance your local library has a copy of Roadside Picnic. Mine does, along with 2 other books by the Strugatskys, Hard to Be a God and The Dead Mountaineer's Inn. Stalker is available for free on YouTube. Head over to the MoozE channel, I've put the link in the description. The Stalker games are available on GOG and Steam. If you are after the original experience, Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl is available on both platforms for $19.99 USD, and it regularly goes on sale. Thanks for watching. I hope the labor I've done has been of some benefit, or at the very least, interesting.